Within a single generation, the most sophisticated world that had ever existed simply stopped existing. Not slowly, not gracefully. The great palace complexes of Mycenaean Greece burned to the ground. The Hittite Empire vanished so completely that later civilizations forgot it had ever existed. Ugarit, the jewel of the Levantine coast, was reduced to ash. Egypt survived barely and never truly recovered. For centuries, scholars had a name for the force behind this catastrophe: the Sea Peoples, mysterious invaders from somewhere beyond the known world, who arrived at the moment of maximum vulnerability and tore the Bronze Age apart. That explanation held for a very long time. Then ancient DNA extracted from 3,000-year-old bones began telling a different story entirely. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what existed. By the middle of the second millennium, BC, the Eastern Mediterranean had built something the world had never seen before. Egypt in the southwest, the Hittite Empire dominating Anatolia, Mycenaean Greece to the northwest, Babylon and Assyria anchoring the east. Smaller but wealthy kingdoms threading the connections between them. These powers traded with each other, corresponded with each other, intermarried with each other. We know this because 350 cuneiform tablets discovered at Amarna preserve the actual diplomatic correspondence of the age. Great kings addressing each other as brothers, negotiating trade agreements, complaining when gold shipments arrived short. The shared language of all this correspondence was Babylonian, not because Babylon dominated the others, but because centuries of contact had produced a common diplomatic tongue. A single trading vessel recovered from the seabed off southwestern Turkey in 1984 makes the point viscerally. The Uluburan shipwreck, dating to around 1300 BC, carried copper ingots from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa, pottery from Greece, and grain from Egypt in a single hold. One ship, half the known world. That vessel was not an anomaly. It was a symbol of a system functioning at a level of complexity that would not be matched again for centuries. Then, around 1177 BC, it ended. Pharaoh Ramesses III recorded what happened in monumental inscriptions at Medinet Habu, a coalition of peoples moving together. Warriors in feathered headdresses and horned helmets had already torn through the Hittites, through Carchemish, through Arzawa, before arriving at Egypt's border. No land, the inscription declares, had been able to stand before them. Ramesses claimed total victory. Pharaohs never lost. But a pharaoh who was genuinely winning did not need to explain quite so carefully how dangerous the enemy had been. What the Egyptian sources cannot tell us is where these people came from. For most of the 2 centuries since the French Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rouget first used the phrase peoples of the sea in 1855, scholars had been circling the same difficulty. 9 or 10 named groups, wildly different appearances in the Egyptian reliefs, no written records from the sea peoples themselves. What scholarship was left with was pottery and helmet shapes, and pottery and helmet shapes can only take you so far. Then ancient DNA changed the terms of the debate. The most significant genetic study focused on the Philistines, the group with the strongest archaeological case for a sea people's origin. Researchers extracted ancient DNA from individuals buried in the earliest layers of Ashkelon, one of the 5 cities of the Philistine world, covering the period from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age. What they found was a clear and unambiguous signal of European ancestry in the earliest Philistine burials, ancestry that was simply absent in the Canaanite population that had occupied the same region in the preceding centuries. This was not a marginal statistical trace. It was a genuine biological discontinuity marking the arrival of a population from somewhere else, pointing specifically towards southern Europe and the Aegean. For the first time, the archaeological argument and the genetic argument were pointing in the same direction. But then came the detail that reframes everything. Within 2 or 3 generations, the distinct European genetic signal in the earliest Philistine burials begins to fade. By the later Iron Age layers at Ashkelon, it is blended substantially into the surrounding Levantine population. The sea peoples arrived, settled, integrated, and within a few generations their descendants were genetically indistinguishable from the broader regional population they had supposedly invaded. The boundary dissolved, the identity persisted in culture and memory long after it had ceased to exist in biology. That is not the signature of a conquering force reshaping the world in its own image. That is the signature of a displaced people finding somewhere to land. And the more carefully the evidence is examined, the clearer it becomes that the Sea Peoples were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were one of its products. The system was already failing before the black sails appeared. Pollen samples from lake beds across the eastern Mediterranean tell a consistent story of severe prolonged drought beginning around 1200 BC. In highland kingdoms like the Hittites, already dependent on grain shipments traveling enormous distances, sustained crop failure was not an inconvenience, it was existential. Seismological analysis of the same period reveals a remarkable clustering of major earthquakes across Greece, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant. Destruction layers at multiple sites match the signature of seismic damage rather than deliberate burning. And then there are the palace fires themselves. At several Bronze Age sites, the palace structures burned while the surrounding settlements did not. That is not the signature of an outside invader sweeping through indiscriminately. That is the signature of people who knew exactly what they wanted to destroy. Internal collapse, social fracture, a system too brittle to absorb simultaneous shocks from multiple directions without shattering entirely. The Sea Peoples arrived at the moment of maximum vulnerability. But the vulnerability was not their creation. Ramesses, the Third's own inscriptions record something his triumphalism cannot conceal. He settled defeated Sea Peoples groups in Canaan as Egyptian vassals. The Philistines were planted along the southern Levantine coast as a buffer population. You could turn back a fleet on the Nile. You could not turn back the displacement of entire populations with nowhere else to go. The Philistine culture that followed became one of the most archaeologically visible of the early Iron Age. Aegean-style pottery, changed food practices, new architectural traditions, a people establishing itself, drawing on origins carried across the Mediterranean while slowly absorbing the landscape it had landed in. Their names survived in the Old Testament long after their biology had blended invisibly into the region. The Sea Peoples were not a mystery civilization from beyond the known world. The DNA confirmed they were products of the Bronze Age Mediterranean itself. People displaced by drought, freed from collapsed palace authority, drawn into a vacuum created by the simultaneous failure of every stabilizing force in the region. They were running from the same disaster they appeared to be causing. The Bronze Age collapse was not visited upon the ancient world by an alien force. It was generated from within, by the same interconnected, ambitious, desperate humanity that had built that world in the first place. They destroyed it. They survived it. And in the most literal biological sense, they became the populations that followed.